If you experience something difficult, maybe even traumatic in early life, that can kind of fingerprint on the developing circuits in ways that it's going to impact the story you tell about yourself, who you are, what you're worth, what you're not worth, how people perceive you, because it's imprinted so early on in life, could potentially be kind of part of the foundation of the building of this person that kind of stays with you in adulthood and then shapes your adult stories, how you perceive your experiences later in life. What is the biological concept of inheriting other people's stories? So there are some elements of that are genetics, right? There are genes that encode how we form as humans, that we can, depending on the gene and the way it's expressed, can inherit from one or more parents. Overwhelmingly, though, what we are learning from the biological field is there's this other mechanism that is kind of more prominent in carrying the impact of the life of a parent to the life of the child. And what that is called epigenetics. So it's things that are happening biologically, but they're not actually genes that are being inherited or genes that are being mutated. It's things that are happening around the genes, biological processes, that impact whether that gene is turned on or off, how strongly it's turned on, where it's turned on and where it's turned off. And all of that is coded by one or more parents' influence on the child.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to season 4 of Coffee Break. This season, we've been exploring this concept of personal narratives, the personal narratives that we carry about ourselves and the internal stories that shape who we believe we are. And today we have a very special guest with us. We have Tahilia Rebello. She is the vice president of the One Mind Academy, where she leads initiatives that integrate science, research, training, and education across One Mind to drive progress in neuroscience and mental health. She has 18 years of experience in mental health and earned her PhD from Columbia University, studying the long-term effects of early life stress and trauma. She later trained at the World Health Organization in Switzerland, shifting her focus to public health and global mental health. She has held scientific leadership and consultancy roles at World Health Organization, the Africa Mental Health Training and Research Foundation, and Columbia University. And her previous work includes supporting World Health Organization's mental health guidelines, managing global research on detecting and diagnosing mental health conditions, building clinician training platforms, and developing programs in East Africa and Japan to address mental health and trauma. Tahilia finds deep personal connection between nature and mental health, seeing in it a reflection of constant evolution, resilience, and growth. So Tahilia, I know you've been in a period of transition and travel, so thank you so much for being with us here today. It's such a treat to be able to have you on.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Liz. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So, as you know, this season we're exploring the topic of personal narratives, and every single person has a set of beliefs or stories that they tell themselves. And these narratives shape how we interact with the world and with ourselves. And we all hold these narratives maybe around our bodies, around our friendships, our families, around love or partnerships. And you're someone who's spent a great deal of time researching and working in mental health. So we're hoping that you could help us shed some light on this subject, because our minds and our thoughts are constantly telling us a story. And the mind is so powerful. It can shape our very realities. And sometimes our very own thoughts can work against us. So I feel like a great place to start is at the very beginning. And I wanted to ask you, how do our early life experiences and the environments we grow up in shape the personal narratives that we carry into our adulthood?
Yeah, thanks, Grace. First, I love this kind of focus on storytelling, internally, externally, the narratives that we create within ourselves as we form as human beings and kind of move through the earth and are sculpted by our experiences. So, your question specifically is about kind of early life, right? And how these stories start forming. Well, when you're born into this world, in some ways you're inheriting other people's stories. The environment in which you're born into is one that you can't control when you're born into a specific family. And that environment can be conceptualized kind of very broadly in terms of physical and built environment. So, what does the household look like? What does your family structure look like? What kind of community do you live within? Are there green spaces? Is it a city? Is it a rural area? But there's also a very complex internal biological inheritance, right? Of the way in which your brain circuits are forming, which is sculpted then by the environment. But you have certain genes and genetic kind of profile that you also inherit from your parents that kind of pushes you maybe in one direction and how you perceive information, how you take in sensory information, what are salient stimuli in in the environment for you, things like that you notice, things that you notice less. All of these things are really important as we start creating our sense of self, which is really kind of at the underpins this idea of our personal narrative. Who are we? What kind of person am I? Who am I kind of innately and kind of in this objective way, but also who am I in relation to the many interpersonal relationships that I have? That all is carved out very early on by the first formative experiences, right? When you look at how the brain is developing during those early times, you can imagine that these early experiences have a big and kind of oversized impact on the way you're eventually going to think. Because in the beginning of your own development as a human, but also kind of biological development, in the brain, circuits are still forming. They're constantly growing. There's this process called neurogenesis happening in the brain where new neurons are forming, right? And so if you experience something difficult, maybe even traumatic in early life, that can kind of fingerprint on the developing circuits in ways that it's going to impact the story you tell about yourself, who you are, what you're worth, what you're not worth, how people perceive you. And that, because it's imprinted so early on in life, could potentially be kind of part of the foundation of the building of this person that kind of stays with you in adulthood and then shapes your adult stories, how you perceive your experiences later in life. So these early life experiences are just so formative in and kind of where a lot of our stories and the not necessarily full narratives, but the way again that we are developing in order to interact with the world. Things like our inner coping skills, our resilience, how we perceive information, what we see, what we don't see, these elements that I mentioned before. A lot of that is happening, and we're kind of gaining the very core skills that, again, stay with us into adulthood. And those things really help us figure out who we are. And, it helps sculpt the way we think about what's happened to us. Confirmation biases, are we now trained to just see the negative things? Actually, there is data neurobiologically that supports that humans generally tend to be more responsive to negative stimuli than positive, rewarding stimuli. If there's a lot of negative things happening early on, there's a lot of stress, a lot of trauma, those kind of stay with us. And in a kind of system that's already somewhat designed to be, in a way, be protective by seeing the negative stimuli, that's what helped us evolve and kind of be alive now after, millions of years, because we could sense where predators were coming from. We had a sense of anxiety, healthy anxiety that kept us alert and hyper vigilant to stress and trauma. And if those circuits that are meant to protect us and can be valuable are overstressed or kind of strengthened in ways that are not healthy, they can help carve out the internal monologue that we have within us. And that internal monologue can be unhealthy in the context of an otherwise generally healthy person who just sometimes tends to be negative or, has a sense of maybe learned helplessness or kind of hopelessness, or it could be in the context of evolving into a mental health condition that requires clinical or therapeutic intervention, right? A lot of what we know about depression and anxiety disorders now is that they have their roots in early life and neurodevelopment. And even though we think of those disorders as kind of, clinical diagnoses, a lot of what's happening internally is around storytelling. What are the stories that these people are telling themselves in these states, right? Are they negative ones? Are they ones of hypervigilance, of threat, of feeling constantly in fear? Those are stories. I also want to say that we often focus on kind of one end of the mental health spectrum where it's kind of the negative stories and kind of depression and anxiety and illness. But just as the systems in early life where stories are forming are sensitive to negative influences, they're also really sensitive to positive ones. And that's why, depending on the roles we have in other people's lives, young people's lives, whether they're our own children or in our own families, nephews, nieces, or in our communities, that period is such an important one where enriched environment can really help create healthy, thoughtful, resilient people who, if the experience of trauma comes up later, that this foundation is strong enough that they can often manage it because these circuits in early life have been created in ways that are going to be okay for this person. They're going to have the skills. And those aren't all just biological circuits, it's environments as well, coming from a supportive environment where people are present, where they feel that they can speak up and they're heard, where there's a sense of hope, where there's a sense of precedence for change to happen. That is all really healthy and just as valuable in helping not just think about how we can influence the lives of people kind of younger and how they end up being, but as we think about kind of more social interventions for mental health more broadly, right? Thinking about how the experience of poverty in young life could impact things and the way war and civil unrest and early life trauma can impact things, the experience of prejudice and racism in early life, the lack of access to resources and food and education, how those things, which aren't often thought of right away when you think about mental health interventions, it's more clinical, but these are ways that these things, poverty, experience of racism and prejudice, civil war, unrest, kind of chaos and volatility, those sculpt people's stories in very real ways by impacting their biologies and impacting their, obviously, environment.
I've been thinking a lot about what you just shared, but in terms of how much certain stressors in life or certain experiences can be carried through generations
Yes.
that are then experienced and passed on.
Right.
And how much of that is almost genetic.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the science around that. So, for generations, we've observed that, just as you said, things that have happened to our ancestors, our grandparents, our parents, even in some ways, as I opened with, we inherit them, literally. We inherit other people's stories. We're kind of born into other people's stories, and then that becomes part of ours, and then we evolve from there. So what is the biological concept of inheriting other people's stories? So there are some elements of that are genetics, right? There are genes that encode how we form as humans that we can, depending on the gene and the way it's expressed, can inherit from one or more parents.
Mm.
The overwhelmingly, though, what we are learning from the biological field is there's this other mechanism that is kind of more prominent in carrying the impact of the life of a parent to the life of the child in a reductionist model. And what that is called epigenetics. So epi means outside of, and genetics is genes. So it's things that are happening biologically, but they're not actually genes that are being inherited or genes that are being mutated. It's things that are happening around the genes, biological processes, that impact whether that gene is turned on or off, how strongly it's turned on, where it's turned on and where it's turned off. And all of that is coded by one or more parents' influence on the child. And that is called the epigenetic kind of inheritance model. And really, what it is, it's chemical groups that we all are accumulating constantly with time. And some of that, those chemical changes get passed on to our offspring. And it's a concrete mechanism where in our life, we're collecting stories and experiences, some of which will be passed down. So it's a real mechanism that connects how we inherit other people's stories. One thing that's kind of cool in this story is also that, some of what we know about how environment, which then carves stories, impacts people is that if you look at identical twins, they can have the same genes. They do have the same genes, but their epigenetic profiles can be very different because they each, even though they have the same biologies and same starting point with genes, they may have micro environmental differences. Like even though they grew up in the same family, one went to school in South Texas, and one went to study abroad in Japan. Those experiences can impact what their biologies look like. And ultimately, why does that matter to the story, to the kind of, topic of today is because those changes can impact, again, the things that they can impact the ways in which we process information, how we have interpersonal relationships, how sensitive we are to something that happens in our lives, all the things that help sculpt our internal narratives and our sense of who we are, right? So that's a really cool element of science that I really value because it really ties in this idea that we're not just genes and neurons and circuits in a meat sack, but we are constantly evolving and being impacted by our environment. And in that way, our perceptions of ourself, the perceptions of our world, and how those two interact, our stories, also have the potential to evolve.
So what I'm hearing is that the environment also just plays such a huge role in impacting who you become and the narratives that you can carry into adulthood. I'm curious if for you personally, are there any narratives that you've found that from your early life or even culture, whatever it may be, that you've noticed that you've carried into your adulthood that maybe you've ended up challenging or that have stuck out to you in the context of this conversation, if you're willing to share?
Yeah, I might have to workshop some of this. I didn't think this through as much, but the first one that really comes up for me is the story that I have about being a tourist in this world. And let me explain it a little bit. So I was born in India, but the part of India that I was from is, we're a religious and kind of, I wouldn't say ethnic minority, but a cultural minority in India. So already I was born into this context of feeling kind of different from those around us. We come from this state called Goa. It was a Portuguese colony up until almost 1970s, maybe mid 1960s. I can't remember exactly. We didn't speak the same language as the rest of India. The religion is primarily, Catholicism. The type of food we ate was different. It's by the water. So there's all this kind of piece of, I'm Indian, but I'm different. When I was 4.5 or so, we moved to Thailand. I grew up in Bangkok. So again, I was an immigrant there. There was this, again, evolving story about differences and how there's richness in my experience, but I'm now changed in a way that feels indelible. Like I'll never fully fit in India, and I never really fit there even when I was born. And I'll never fully fit in Bangkok because I'm not, Thai and I come from this other place. Then when I was almost when I was 14, we moved to Canada, and there was another kind of change. And in my life, I've moved around quite a lot. And, especially from India to Thailand, that's already a culture change. Thailand to Canada, that's another culture change. Then I moved to the United States for graduate school. I was a little more fully formed, but, I was in my early 20s. I think, just turned 22. So if, you know a little bit about the brain, there's this area called the prefrontal cortex that is responsible things like attention, cognition, decision making, kind of higher order thinking. It's still kind of forming. It's still not fully done at that age. It's getting there, but not fully done. So there were a lot of changes that are a huge part of my narrative and impact my mental health, impact the way I feel like I belong or don't belong, the way I feel like I'm heard or not heard, um, the sense of coming from a culture that's very different from my parents' origin culture, which further sculpted my environment, right, in terms of the advice they could give, and even things really related to the conversation we're going to have around mental health care, not knowing kind of the vocabulary that we use to talk about mental health and distress and trauma and tragedy in the family, all of which we experienced. Um, that that was very obvious from this narrative of I'm a tourist here in kind of almost every context. And that has very much been a part of my narrative. And I've been able to reframe it in some ways because there's beauty in being a tourist. You get to see things in this kind of sparkly way because they're new. There's this novelty element that's incredibly beautiful to learn about new cultures, learn new languages. You are changed, but you're changed in ways that are also so meaningful and help you make connections that you wouldn't otherwise make. So one piece that I want to pull out of this narrative of my own is that, culture is another element of environment that really sculpts the narratives that we tell
Mm,
ourselves internally, right? And kind of a very concrete, almost clinical example of that is the way in which people even talk about their mental health symptoms. There are some cultures where they won't use the word depression or anxiety. That's very, in some ways, global north, right? Things that maybe you'd say in the UK, or Canada or the United States. But there are some cultures that talk about like losing power, or they feel deflated, or they talk more about their somatic symptoms, like a heaviness on my chest, or I feel like I'm carrying a load. That's really interesting because it's a concrete way about that shows how words that form stories, either those words said in your head and internally or externally, are so sculpted by what you hear around us, right? And that's another way in which environment really shapes us. And because environment is not just the families that we're born into, like I said, but the communities that we're born into. And what's really interesting, Grace and Liz, is that this idea of environment shaping us and the stories that we tell is getting more and more complex. Because imagine the 1850s, your community was limited by potentially just geography, right? Like our great grandparents, all three of us, likely didn't, maybe they did, but they likely didn't travel very much further than the communities they were born in, right? Apologies if that's an assumption, but my grandparents definitely didn't until later in life. Most families and people didn't have that experience. Even now, that's true. But with the advent of the internet and social media, what we define as someone's environment is no longer just physical and built space. It's kind of the content that we're interacting with, the we can now see how someone, deals with loss in a small village in Uganda. We can see how someone experiences love, in New York City, even though you are part of this tiny town in, Provence, right? The the type of information that we have access to now, sensory, that might not be our own experience, but that can help sculpt our stories, has expanded in the last couple of decades. And as we get to the question about, what do I think forward, what's exciting to me and what am I curious about? That's one thing I'm curious about, how the advent of kind of big data, knowledge access in this kind of incredible breadth and depth that we can have access to now, how's that going to sculpt how we move through the world? How is that going to impact how our internal narratives, our external narratives? We're already seeing this impact younger generations in many good ways and many not so good ways, right? Like how they experience adolescence. I mean, that show came out about like incel culture and all these things that probably the three of us didn't really have to contend with. We may have heard a little bit about it, but and that's a big thing because it impacts stories and it can impact our well-being in really significant ways.
Yeah, it is definitely like a strange and new thing where it's like the younger generations, you can have an entire community that you've never met in person before, and it
Right.
just purely exists online. How much exactly would you say the content that we consume affects us?
I think that's really hard to say. I There might be some data that kind of more specifically gets at that. My answer would be a lot, but it varies. And it varies because people had varying interactions with online platforms, online communities. Um, some people, if we're thinking more broadly with environments, some people, stay in their small towns their whole life. Others move around a lot. So it really does vary, but I think there's a huge role, and it's not just me thinking it. There's data that supports that environment plays a very substantial role in the way in which we identify self, the stories that we tell, our mental health and well-being. And that can go in both directions. I definitely do want to make that case that, there are things that the environment can do to push us to the side of the mental health continuum that are closer to distress and illness, but that can also push us to the sense of community, creativity, connection, all the very human things that many of us want for our lives. So I think it's a lot. The other thing I would say is that um, there is some value in kind of chunking it into environment and biology, right? It is important to know that those two interact in very meaningful ways. So your biologies, like I've said before, influence how you interact with the environment. And your environment can suppress certain biological vulnerabilities. So there's real studies around that. For example, some people have maybe a genetic change that make them more vulnerable to anxiety and depression later in life, right? But we can see that not everybody who has that genetic change has depression or has anxiety. Well, why is that? If the gene told the whole story, why aren't they getting depressed, or why aren't they getting anxiety? And partly it's because of the way um, genes work, but also the protective element of the environment. So in genetics, there's a term called penetrance. And basically, it's like if you have the gene, what is the probability that you're going to have the thing that the gene is encoding? So let's say this doesn't exist. There's not one gene that causes depression. It's polygenic. But let's say there was one gene that caused depression. Um, if there was 100% penetrance, that means every single person who had the genetic change would have depression because that's the main factor. Um, We don't have that for most genes, not just ones that are related to mental health and well-being. There's a couple of genes like cystic fibrosis, the one of the breast cancer genes, where there's a high chance that if you have that genetic change, you're going to get the illness or you're going to get the symptom. But I mean, this, and some of that is because of biological processes, because the body is beautiful. Science is just magnificent. It's one of the things I'm very passionate about and see such art in. But, the bodies are created in way there's redundant pathways. So even though there's a gene that could, potentially really mess things up, maybe there's other pathways that get recruited, so it kind of compensates for it. So some of this lack of, 100% penetrance is because of genes, but a lot of it is because of environment, to get back to your question, because environment can sculpt the way we move through the world.
This makes me think about, I guess, going back to the narratives that we picked up on from our early life. In preparation for this conversation, I was kind of thinking of like, what are the narratives that I might personally carry that have come from my environment or early life? One of the thoughts is that the more needed that I am, the more valuable I am. And carrying that belief from, I think, honestly, like culture and from my parents' own belief systems that they've carried, and then the way that they raised us. And a lot of it is around, I think, sacrifice and around, especially for women, I think, in the culture and in my upbringing. So something that I've been thinking about and recognizing is the way that that has solidified into acting in a way of performing or allowing people to overstep certain boundaries, or overextending myself in order to fulfill this belief that the more needed I am, the more valuable I am. And then coming to a point in adulthood of recognizing that this belief is not working for me any longer. And that's something that I wanted to explore in this conversation as well. Is I feel like it's one thing to recognize when you've carried a belief into adulthood and you find that this belief is no longer serving you. And maybe at one point in your life, it allowed you to thrive in the environment that you were in, or it protected you. But change is so hard. So I'm curious, what do you have to say about why is it so difficult for people to change and experience deep emotional transformation? And how have you tackled change in terms of these narratives that you have carried personally?
Well, first, thank you so much for sharing that, Grace. I think it's one that, a narrative that will resonate with a lot of people out there, especially women, and especially people from certain cultures. It's definitely one that I have as well, this utilitarian purpose. Like, what if I'm not being useful? That I wouldn't say it's so dramatic that I feel like unworthy, but it definitely is. I need to be useful in this earth. And it is one that can be helpful in some contexts and often can be unhelpful and lead down paths that, like you said, violate your boundaries, may not no longer serve you well with your, values in adulthood, may open you up to risk and vulnerability that you don't need to put yourself into. This question about change being hard, funnily enough, is one of my narratives as well, that it's just so hard to change. Like, when I try to do something new and I just go back to the same habit again, I've experienced a sense of frustration. And I say, like, well, this is just me. I'm not disciplined. Like, I can't do this. And there are many counters to that. The first one is noticing, to be honest, noticing that you're actually doing that. And that is a principle that comes in from the, various different fields, but it's definitely used in kind of the clinical space and therapy, like this concept of mindfulness, being mindful of your mind in this kind of meta way, watching your thoughts and saying, Okay. This thought that I have reflected on through either journaling or through conversation with friends, right? There's such an important mirror that's held to us by the people around us, can be so valuable that you come to this insight, or through therapy. That is another way to get to the insight. That now, okay, I have this concept that's not serving me well about my, need to be needed and usefulness, defining my worth, being thoughtful about it, and then assessing with grace, no pun intended, to yourself, in what context does this come up? Does it come up in certain contexts with certain peoples, under certain stress environments? Is it in a work environment? Is it in a personal environment? Kind of deep diving into unpacking some of what this is. The way to change it is difficult, but it's in many scenarios addressable with a stepped response, right? So there's this first kind of more low intensity response of journaling, mindfulness, maybe even like YouTube videos where there's, psychiatrists and psychologists sharing information, talking with friends, kind of communal supports. Then in therapy, there are ways in which you can address some of these narratives that have become so unhelpful that they are kind of bordering the threshold for, illness or distress. And you don't always have to wait till it gets there to seek care. Therapy can be a place to unpack things before they become a real problem. But in therapy, in that context, there are things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which are evidence-based models. By that, I mean that someone thought this was a good idea, then they tried it with a whole bunch of people who had the intervention, a whole bunch of people with the same kinds of issues that didn't have the intervention, and those that had this CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy intervention, did better. And better is defined by things like their anxiety was lowered. They could shift this narrative. They felt healthier. They were, in a relationship now. They were back at work now, things like that. So in therapy, you can have access to tools that can help make change a bit easier, especially if it's felt stagnated. And even if you've tried kind of journaling, talking through it, other ways of addressing it, yoga, meditation, all really valuable, but in some cases, not enough.
Mhm.
So these models in therapy can really help change things. Some of it is also access to information, knowing that change is hard, because to tie it back to the story that we started with, that early life, if things have happened to you early on, those circuits are kind of there, and it's going to take a little bit longer to undo them, unravel those Christmas lights and put the plugs in the right places so it looks prettier and the tree is how you want it to be. That takes time, that takes intention, that takes effort. And sometimes that takes, like I said, specialist intervention or kind of specialist knowledge about, what are the right ways to do it. And though, so giving yourself, like I said, some grace around change being difficult, that it can be a step process, it can take time, and that it's okay to sometimes feel like it's not completely linear, that, with 6 sessions, you're not out of this narrative. Like it can come back and forth. And to also remember most things in life can be useful in certain scenarios. There are scenarios where your sense of duty and obligation serve you well. I'm sure you can think of them. And so kind of sitting with that element of it too. I would also say that, some of these thoughts and habits are just deeply ingrained, and you often need the permissive environment, whether it's time in your life or the people around you, or the kind of physical space around you to feel ready for change. So the timing could feel off. Other times, there could be a big stimulus for change. People have lose someone in their life that makes them rethink their narrative. People get married that makes them think they're rethink their narrative. So there is this like non-linearity that happens. The final thing I would say about change being hard is one that I tell myself to question that. Um, where are the times where I have tried to do something and it felt like I've kept going in circles, but if I step back, I have been moving in the right direction, right? It's kind of like the stock markets, which is they're really scary right now. Like, do not look at them. But overall, despite, the 2008 financial crisis, COVID pandemic, kind of what's going on right now, the curve is always upwards. If you look on it on an everyday basis, it might feel chaotic and in kind of acute trajectories can feel chaotic. But as long as you're moving in the general up direction, that's okay. And to forgive yourself if it's not always going up as well. That you have the capability and hopefully access to tools and support, right? Which is a health equity issue and kind of tying back to kind of systems around us that people have access to that make change easier and less easy for others, which is tied back to the story around poverty, experience of discrimination. Certain communities don't feel like change is harder because honestly, change is harder for them. It might be harder for them to access therapy, to access care. If some of their distress is coming from lack of employment, it's a real thing that they might not have opportunities available to them. And that's why, we have to ask ourselves as society when we think about doing this work, helping people live out the stories they want to live. Um, that's not just on individual people. We need to be thinking about systems that help create healthy stories, systems that help us be healthy and have good well-being. So to summarize, change is hard. You have to think about how you're measuring change because you might be moving in the upward direction. It just might not be exactly what you want. Sometimes you might have to pivot in kind of what the outcome of success looks like for your change. Consider that the thing that you're trying to change, there's some maybe value in being in it as well. Of course, if it's toxic, traumatic, don't camp out there, right? Know that some things you can modify yourself, some things you might need to get help from either professionals, your community, your friend group. There's other tools too that we haven't considered that are really important to the stories we tell. They're kind of related to the culture piece, right? Spirituality, that plays a big role in people's lives in sense of self and kind of finding meaning when things are difficult. And I there is a role for that. There's, I always think of kind of when we want to support ourselves or others, think of the entire toolkit of things that we need, right? It's also things like sleep and food and art and joy and laughter and connection. And all of those things are part of this toolkit of that can help change the narrative.
Yeah, there's such a big part of that is the simple things like you just said, where sometimes you're having a really bad day or an off day, and then you ask yourself, well, did I sleep? Did I eat? Did I see people? Did I get some sunlight? And I feel like simple changes like that can drastically create an environment to support you to support your mental health. But I really love what you said about it being overall positive trajectory and to take a step back and look at the whole journey. Because when you look at every day, sometimes it feels like I always tell Liz, like I feel like it's like 3 steps forward and then 2 steps back. But when you look at the whole thing, it's like, okay, I have changed and I have been making progress. And I think so much of that is in, like you said, one, having the awareness to recognize your own patterns, to examine it, and then to set the intention, even if it's really small. Like for me, for example, it could be as small as saying no to attending a social gathering that I didn't feel like aligned with who I am anymore, or didn't align with people that I want to surround myself with anymore, to not do things out of guilt or obligation, which has been a big one for me. But it's like, I recognize like I still make decisions out of that desire to not disappoint people or to show up in a way where I'm needed when I know that it's no longer good for me. I still recognize that I do it, but in the process of becoming more and more self-aware and then taking that small step to move in a direction that's unfamiliar.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Absolutely. That's really important too, what you just said. Some of this is habits around openness to novel ways of moving through the world, right? And this is something that's tied to your early life experiences. Did you feel safe to kind of venture into new ideas? Did you feel that you could try on a new kind of way of moving through the world, right? Like, for example, it's something simple like, how will I be perceived if I start taking hip hop dancing classes? It's not something I've historically done. It's not something I imagine I'd be very good at, but I kind of want to try it out. Some of these things are about psychological safety, feeling safe in the environments that you're in, and internally as well. And some I would say to go back to the change piece, and it's tied to this intention setting that you talked about, is it's practice. It's a skill development to learn how to modify behaviors and habits, and then even internal processes. They're often not one-off. They can be in certain kind of therapeutic scenarios. There's more and more we're learning where we can, stimulate a part of the brain and behavior changes like that. But that's very extreme, and not everybody has access to that kind of intervention. But just remembering, if you want to grow your biceps, that takes work. Some days it's painful. You don't see progress all the time. You also have to do other things like eat the right food and, rest and recover. Holistically, the process of rewriting a narrative is also practicing it.
Mm-hmm. That's so
I
true.
love that. You've mentioned, psychological safety now a couple of times, and also I know you touched on the macro part of this conversation, so of course I want to get to that. But something that I've personally just been interested in a lot lately is the parental aspect of, child's development. And I'm just thinking of people listening to this conversation, maybe those who are parents or parents of maybe young children. What would you say are some key things that they could keep in mind to help in the way that they can to create a space for their child that where they feel psychologically safe? Because I think for many parents, we don't have a guidebook we're not introduced to guidebook on parenting traditionally in school, right? So I think if you do have any like key practical things in mind for them, I know this wasn't part of our prep for this conversation, but it just came to mind for me as we were talking about it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would be able to speak more generally about the concept of psychological safety and then kind of tie it into the home environment, the parental and the interactions with children. I'm not a parent yet. And it's not my area of expertise. So I'm happy to talk about this, but with that lens and that kind of caveat. So, generally, a psychologically safe environment is one where people feel that they can be honest without, worrying that they'll be rejected or attacked or kind of judged, that there's no real negative consequences for speaking up, for even dissenting sometimes, that they won't receive negative consequences or again be judged or laughed at for admitting that they don't know something, that they want some help, that they want to try something new that they haven't done before. It's also an element of a trust and respect and support, even when there's disagreements. So it's not an environment that's just nice. and happy all the time. Sometimes it can feel and sound like there's conflict because that is truly a psychologically safe environment. That sometimes people's borders come rub up against each other within a family unit, within workplace teams, other interpersonal relationships, right? So it doesn't always look like you're always agreeing with the person. It doesn't always look like, yes, exactly. It actually shows up and is tested when there is conflicting ideas, right? And conflict isn't a bad thing necessarily. Like, I hope that's one of the recurring themes, right? Like this, the feeling of being needed boundary. I mentioned it in that context, Grace, that might serve you well in some time, at some point. My sense of feeling like an outsider, there's value that brings, kind of the ability to kind of code shift and be part of many groups and really connect with different people. In this case, too, conflict is kind of a good thing. And in psychologically safe environments, for example, if it's a family unit, that there's opportunities, value, calmness in response when a child or a spouse or other partner, grandparent brings up an idea that may not resonate, that there's space for that and that's considered. So how you bring this to fruition within a family unit, I'm not the expert on, but I would imagine it would be very similar to the way we think about making it happen in work teams, which is a lot of what I think about as part of my One Mind at Work. So there's elements that are kind of more simple, like listening without judgment, right? Setting a precedence that you truly listen, giving your full attention, for example, when the child speaks or your coworker speaks, letting them finish without interrupting or correcting them immediately, showing curiosity rather than criticism. This is a habit that I have because I'm trained as a scientist, and it's not a good one for psychological safety, but I'm going to be honest about it. I'm constantly thinking about the counterpoint in my head. I'm like, oh, but what about this? It's like debate team in my head. And I'm like, I have to catch myself and say, this isn't what this is about. This isn't necessarily valuable in this situation. So not, kind of as the person's talking, waiting for your turn to now interject with your ideas. So truly listening, that is a habit and a skill that can be learned. It doesn't have to be, well, I'm not a good listener. Well, you can be a good listener, right? I'm not a good driver, but that's not because I'm innately bad. It's because I'm a New Yorker and I haven't really practiced that much, but I can be good. Validation of feelings, of, acknowledging what's going on. And I would say, it's the era within a family unit is complex. When you're doing this, you're teaching your children how to respond to you as well. It's not just, and as they age, they're going to treat you in ways that you have modeled and mimicked, right? And so at some point, a family unit with kind of more grown children, the safety that can be created is not just from the parents down to the child. It's kind of complexly within all of those kind of interrelationships within a family unit. So validation of feelings, normalizing mistakes and learning, setting boundaries is a really important one too, kind of sticking to, gentle consequences for certain behaviors that are not psychologically safe, or encouraging questions and curiosity, avoiding harsh criticism or shaming, celebrating when things go well, when someone, helps foster psychological safety, not just kind of the outcomes of the decision. Like if we want to plan a family vacation and someone says, oh, let's go to the moon, that's a cool idea. We can't do it, but it's, I would imagine that if my child said that, that would be like, wow, you're so creative. That's cool. Like think big. I love it. Right. But then also being practical with, well, we can't go to the moon. We like that idea, but it's not just about, yes, this was an excellent idea, kind of in some ways fostering this concept of design thinking, right? Where it's safe to just like throw out ideas, because some of the ones will not make any sense, but they might iteratively help you get to a good idea. You can do that within family units for sure. Staying calm during conflict, allowing autonomy even in young children, and voice to the extent that they can pick the thing they're picking or showing autonomy around is appropriate, right? Some things as a parent you would have to make the decision for them. And fostering this sense of that you're a safe place for them to come to. Again, I'm not a parent and not an expert in this, so I imagine that some of these seem idealistic to parents out there, and they are hard. They're sometimes idealistic even in work settings in which we try to foster things like psychological safety. The thing I would say, though, especially getting back to this systems level piece, is the skills and then substrates, the pieces that are needed to build psychological safety don't always have to fall again on family units, right? The way communities are built, the families can be built part of, spiritual communities, kind of physical communities, certain cultural groups, where there can be certain expectations of how you interact with your children. That can sculpt how you are within your family unit, right? Just like in the workplace, if leadership is being open about their mental health struggles and their well-being, maybe someone more junior is like, okay, well, he's sharing it or she's sharing it, they're sharing it. I can maybe ask for a couple of days off because it's been a really rough time and I don't really know what's going on with me. That there's an element of psychological safety that's very individual level and interpersonal, and there's an element of kind of psychological safety that can be cultivated and nurtured through systems design.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And that's actually, great transition into this more macro level conversation that I know that has been particularly on your mind lately. Grace and I talk about this too. We just notice and kind of sense in our community, immediate communities, just almost like there's some kind of breaking point being reached or some very high tension. Uh, and it could be a combination of many things, like you've already mentioned, our communities, the political landscape, things, just the greater systems in our society that many of us are living in traditionally. So what has been on your mind lately more, I guess, at a deeper level? Is there something that you're noticing that really needs to be addressed for people at this current time? Is for me personally, I see especially many young people suffering.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I want to start with the good. There's a lot of really great things going on in the various domains of life. For all the negative that's out there, there are people who care deeply about, social issues, poverty, dismantling structural racism, climate change, curating types of information in a thoughtful manner that young people see. There's a lot of that going on. But in almost every domain that impacts our life, there are things going on that I'm thinking about how they interact with mental health. Like my kind of mantra around this, and it's not just mine, it's very much one that is shared by many in the field, and it's very systems level thinking that our health and this is, I want to quote someone, it's not my quote, I don't know whose it is, but I love it. It's our zip codes dictate as much about our health as our genetic codes. I love that. Where we basically, I would say, it's not capturing all the nuance, but it's capturing a lot of the nuance. It's saying that our health, our mental health and well-being is not just about our biologies or even our access to health systems. That is an important piece. But it's things like the urban infrastructure we live in. Do we live in a community like Harlem, where there is a higher rate of certain conditions. Let's not even talk about mental health conditions for a second, things like asthma, right? And partly that has to do with living conditions, the disinvestment in some of the communal and government housing programs, the light pollution, noise pollution that impacts people's sleep, impacts people way they learn, the way the types of food they have access to. There's this concept of food deserts, right? And so if you want to be healthy fully, you need your environment to look good. So I think about how we're designing cities, what overpopulation is doing to our health, what migration is doing for our health, right? I live nowhere near any family member of my nuclear family. Like the nearest family are cousins and an aunt, 2.5 hour flight away. Um, that's so normal these days. But if you really think about it, that's odd. We're social creatures who should be around people who care deeply for us, people that were, and those don't always have to be family, but so I think about the way in which cities are developed and communities are developed, and the role of communities in sculpting how we move through the world, but how healthy we feel. I also think about, and I think this is something that, is going to be really important and is shown to be really important to young people about, if we look at more broader, not kind of more circumscribed communities, but our planet, what we're doing to the planet and how climate change is impacting us directly, how it's impacting economics, trade, our ability to grow food. We have climate refugees from, island nations whose islands no longer exist or won't exist, the stress that's caused by that, the pressure we're putting on the earth, those are big systems problems that may seem uncoupled to mental health and well-being and stories that we tell, but they're absolutely linked, right? Also, we people are so heterogeneous. We're not a monolith. So even if we're talking about young people, even within the young people community, let's say, for example, there's indigenous youth who have this incredible connection to the land. When they see their land being destroyed, having to move out of lands that they've lived on for generations and generations and generations, that is directly impacting their story, the story of their people, their own stories, and their future stories. And that, you can imagine, is going to impact their well-being and how their mental health and the way they experience hope and what they want from their lives. Political unrest and war, those are, we are seeing so much of it. Young people are born into a world right now where there's so much going on. There's political unrest, which you could argue has been around in many iterations, and in many parts of the world, even when we were younger, and there were, huge, big wars even before we were born. So that has been something there. And just because it's normal and it's happening a lot doesn't mean it's actually healthy or what should be happening or the way in which we should continue to move through time as the human race. Maybe we want to think about dismantling some of those structures that cause these type of conflicts, and I think young people see that a lot. The economic downturns, which aren't always linear either, generations that are born into it or are maturing into the workforce at times when there's low opportunity, that is extremely difficult. There's countless examples of that. But all that to say is that when we think about health, we need to have a systems level view of health as well. Because otherwise, we're going to have to create systems that are only there to help sick people get better, in a really reductionist way of saying it. And we're never going to have enough infrastructure for that. So we need to be thinking upstream of that. We need to be thinking about preventing people from even getting to a place where they feel really sick or unwell or their stories are so damaged. We need to also be thinking about promoting mental health to tie it back to the initial story about this kind of, not story, initial piece that I talked about the mental health continuum, right? We're not only talking about people experiencing distress and illness, we're also talking about the counter to all of that. So we want to be promoting mental health. What does that look like in terms of urban design? What does that look like in terms of job opportunity? What does that look like in terms of political change? What does that look like in terms of using social media to help people make real connections? And I think it took me a while to get to a place where I could see that the population and kind of systems level approach to health is one that is incredibly valuable, and just as much so as kind of basic science research in the lab that's helping us understand mental illness better, just as much as kind of translational research that's taking things that you find in the lab to clinical outcomes and, therapeutics. All of that working together is really important. And arguably some of the best health interventions weren't classically health interventions in the way that you would think about them. They are addressing some of these bigger societal macro issues that trickle down and have change in the way people feel and perceive and experience the world that they live in.
Thank you so much for breaking all of that down. And I'm just kind of curious, can you talk a little bit about how this thought around systems and social factors and things like that intersect with the work that you do at One Mind, and a little bit about One Mind?
Sure, absolutely. So One Mind is a mental health nonprofit that has very much an ecosystem level response to mental health, advancing mental health for all people. What I mean by the ecosystem response is that it's a holistic response. Kind of like what I was talking about with the macro systems element being important, we understand the value of kind of addressing these issues, helping people stay healthy and helping people who aren't healthy get healthier, require kind of multi-pronged approach. And before this, describing some of the programs that we have that help move the field further and help serve people, the two elements that kind of underpin all of our work is science and people. So the science component is that, we're a very evidence-based, data-based, research-based organization. The decisions that we make, the programs that we develop, the way we assess whether the programs are working, whether they're meeting the needs of the people out there, are all based on rigorous science. The people story is one that we hold at parity with the science, and it's the value of people with lived experience. People experiencing serious mental illness, for example, but people of all kinds who have expertise as well, who have insight into, what might work, what doesn't work, what needs to happen. Their stories are very much a part of our work. And actually storytelling and kind of the narrative component, that type of initiative is being led by one of my colleagues as part of the People with Lived Experience Council, which is one of our kind of programs within One Mind. We bring in the narratives and we think about how the stories of people who are out there in distress or have experienced distress or are part of families or communities that are experiencing mental distress or have on the other side, experiences and models at work. How can we incorporate their stories in carving out programs, carving out policies, doing research, getting information out to the public? Really important piece of it. So apart from the People with Lived Experience program, we also have a program around workplace mental health and well-being, workforce mental health and well-being. So this ties well to the story I was talking about before around macro level and kind of thinking about systems and structures and how do we do health work. So this program is an example of us thinking about doing health work within the labor and employment domain. So we work with employers who are committed to doing better for their workforces, helping measure how well they're doing for the workforces that work within their organizations, whether they're small kind of mom and pop shops or really large institutions with, hundreds of thousands of employees around the world. What are they doing that's working? What are they doing that's not working? And what does the science tell them about what to do better? And so we help bridge that gap. We help them measure and we help them do better. And why is that a really valuable approach? Well, because most adults that experience a lot of mental health conditions are, they start earlier on, but most of the kind of bulk of the burden of disease is held by individuals who are in working ages in their 20s to 65 or so. So when you work in workforces and work in workplaces, you're getting to the people who need care, who need services. Second, there's infrastructure to reach them. They are part of this captive audience where you can get messaging out to. Employers can serve as the scaffold in which people can get access to benefits and resources. Employers can serve as leaders to create environments where people can feel connected and creative, where their mental health can be promoted and where mental illness can be prevented. There's the ethical and moral lens, right? If people are struggling at work, there is some moral imperative to get them services, get them back into the workforce if that's what they want. And then there's this element that brings in the employers to the story, that this isn't just an ethical and moral and nice thing to do. It's also really good for business outcomes. We can also tell that story, which is that people who are healthier will show up for work, are less likely to take time off, are less likely to be disengaged from the work, are more creative, psychologically healthy environments in the workplaces that employers can help create, like we talked about before, can help people do better, innovate, collaborate better. So that's part of what this At Work program, One Mind at Work, does, helping kind of operationalize that. So how to do better for if you're an employer. And the reach is, millions of people who are working for all of our member companies. We also address the mental health kind of problem by investing in early stage startups that are directly addressing some sort of issue around mental health access, quality of care, effectiveness of care through some sort of technological model. And that's our One Mind at Work accelerator program. So we invest in them kind of in a broad conception of that word. So there's some financial investment and kind of business development, but also supporting them in their mental health as founders, helping them tell the story of their work. There's a lot of communications kind of workshops that are associated with that piece of our work. And so that is an important element too, right? Because we want to take the science that we have and put it out there into the world. And there are startups and companies that are kind of creating novel models, tech-based models to get that out there. We also have our Rising Star Awards program, which I manage, and which is kind of at the start of the pipeline of innovation in some ways. And that's basic science research grants. So we invest in high risk, high reward scientific research where people are trying to understand the biological mechanisms that may underlie why early life trauma has these long-term effects on our mental health and the stories we tell ourselves or our vulnerabilities to conditions later in life. Like, why is that happening? And can we reverse it? How can we treat it later in life? What are the ways in which we can do that? Is there a way we can detect someone who's more likely to be vulnerable? And we support this kind of rich portfolio of work and scientists who are doing the work that are neuroscience projects, but now very much so into the space of AI and machine learning and natural language processing. How can these more novel tools help us be able to detect patients who show up in settings or people who show up in settings like, the DMV, for example? Is there some screener that we can do there that we're going to be able to capture someone who's at higher risk of a certain type of condition? We're open to innovative ideas. So that is part of our Rising Star Award work, supporting the science and also supporting the people who do the science so that they become thought leaders, that they become empathetic mentors, that they play a role in science advocacy, public engagement, making science fun, some sort of meaningful role outside the lab. As you can see, kind of from this spectrum of programs that we have, workplaces, basic science research, entrepreneurship and business development, technology, people with lived experience. That's kind of what we mean by this this ecological kind of more ecosystem approach that's multi-pronged to doing mental health work. Other organizations are very much focused on clinical trials and specifically research, and we partner with them and we use the data that they generate, but we don't do that kind of work to advance kind of the mental health field.
It sounds like you're doing some amazing work with One Mind, and I'm just really curious based on what you've shared about what One Mind does within organizations and within companies, etc. Are there specific data sets or things that you can point to that you've seen on an organizational level where you've seen, okay, if we put these factors at the forefront of what this organization supports, how does that cultivate a healthier system? And how can that be applied to more macro, larger systems or even countries or communities in terms of, like, for example, what I'm hearing from you is that what you guys cultivate within these organizations is access to shared resources or access to creative outlets and things like that. So I'm wondering if there are very specific things that you found to cultivate healthier systems that could be applied on a larger scale.
Yes, absolutely. I feel this question is teed up perfectly for me to talk about kind of some of the pivotal work that we've done with at One Mind at Work. And it's essentially ask your question and in a research and hypothesis driven way and collect the data from various different fields that help tell us what employers and businesses can do to help create healthier workforces. So we collected data from sociology, psychology, the business world, economics, social economics, behavioral psychology, various different fields. And your question can really be answered by me sharing that one of the things that One Mind at Work has developed in collaboration with others is the Mental Health at Work Index. And so this index basically tells organizations, there's a measurement version of it. It is a measurement tool, but it's also can be thought of as a way of addressing your question, what can we do as an organization to do better for our workforce? What does it actually mean to do better? And there's 10 domains that we measure and then we help them do and prioritize. And they are first, mental health strategy. So organizations that put this in the forefront, they're talking about this with their employees, they're talking about this with their boards, with their leadership, and then they've come together, collected the data to create a thoughtful plan, a mission and vision for what healthy looks like within their workplace. And they have strategic objectives and target goals for this, just as they would do if they had a business product, right? They had a new digital platform. They would do a business development strategy around it. Kind of what does the market look like? What are our needs? How do we expand this? The same type of thing. When you do it within an organization, you thoughtfully strategize what you want to do. And then there's funds that back it and there's people that back it. That works really well in advancing workforce mental health. So strategizing, not just doing things reactively in an ad hoc manner. Like sharing resources is great, but do it within the umbrella of an actual strategy. And you could link it to your business strategy, your other organizational strategy. So that is not just something that sounds good, but there's data that shows that organizations that have a mental health strategy and well-being strategy, the indices for workforce mental health being healthier are higher. Things like higher engagement, less turnover, less burnout. The second is leadership. We've talked about this a little bit before, but leadership showing up is shown to be extremely important. Showing up in terms of using language, sharing their own stories, being vulnerable, creating a psychologically healthy workforce by making it acceptable for people to give them feedback directly. For there to be an anonymous, feedback mechanism within the organization, just different ways of making people feel like their voices can be heard and that the leaders care about it, giving them PTO for mental health. So it's, showing up in words, but also concretely through appropriating funds for mental health and well-being programs, for supporting mental health programming. Like if there's a World Mental Health Day event at the organization, the leader shows up. That's important. People show that this matters. Communications, how people communicate within the organization, the language that they use, how often they communicate, not just about mental health and well-being related pieces, but are you emailing your workers 4 times on a Saturday when they should be on a weekend? You're literally, and is your expectation that they respond? That's creating an environment that, if it's not transparently said that this is how it's going to be, that can impact people's well-being. They might feel like, okay, well, why am I working, out of office hours? I may not be able to charge this for overtime. So communications broadly, right? Of course, the ones that are around sharing resources and information about mental health as well. That's important. There's, many other categories. Maybe I'll say just a couple more. Work design. So whether there's flexible hours. Can people work hybrid if they want to? Can they be fully remote? If they're fully remote, are they still involved in meetings? Are there still is an ability for them to still socialize with their peers? Are they feeling left out? Workforce involvement and engagement. That's another thing that employers can do. Listen to the people. Listen to their stories of what their needs are, what they want, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. All the way from, you have a health plan, but your copays are too high and that's not really working for me. As, an employer, you can listen to that and then make a modification, all the way to, reward and recognition. I don't need to do less work, but please, give me an obvious next step for kind of professional growth. Give me professional development opportunities. Sometimes those things, in the light of everything else the same, like workload, for example, can be the thing that helps people feel healthier in their work environment, more connected to the mission, for example, as well. Those are some examples of the structural level things employers can do. And then, of course, there's also really benefits and resources. You want people to have, if they need to see a therapist or need to see a doctor, right? Because it's holistic health. They have access to that through their work. And so we start with these 10 categories. We help organizations measure using the index where they are in each of these against best practices. And then we give them a score. And the score helps them see where they are in relation to others in their industry, which is part of your second question. Like, what can the story of individual employers tell us about what we can do as larger communities, right? We're now looking at, like, are there certain industries, like in the clinical space, like health systems? Is there some certain behaviors or policy change that needs to happen, or salary change that needs to happen, that's going to help people feel better or be less burned out, or there be less turnover? Legal, in the legal spaces, or something that's been going on that can be shifted around. So we take kind of individual level data and help organizations prioritize and then make concrete change based on the evidence of what works or doesn't work out there. So example, you don't have a strategy? Well, have a strategy. The data shows that it helps. Here's a workshop for you to create a strategy. Here are the steps to do that. Then we aggregate the data And we have our data sets with aggregated index data from a couple of years now, where we can tell what's going on in big versus small organization. We haven't published the industry specific reports, but the idea is to think about this, what we're finding employers are doing or not doing in terms of workforce mental health within industries, but also within regions, right? You probably, from your own experiences or from reading or the experiences of others you've encountered, know that the culture around work is different, even in the United States. Like the culture around work in New York may look very different than from, small Bozeman, Montana. The culture around work in Japan is going to look different from the culture around work in Germany. The days that are allowable for a PTO, the expectations, kind of the power dynamics within organizations are different. So when we're aggregating our data set, we hope to also be able to tell the story of, well, what can we do again systemically? Like what could countries be legislating to protect workers? Things like protected weekend time, number of work hours a week, overtime pay, training, requirements. And it's not all, our that one of the, again, this is not my quote, but I love it. But someone once said, scientists have discovered that the brain is part of the body. I love that because people sometimes talk about mental health kind of separately from like physical health. And we try not to use that terminology because the brain is physical and mental health is not just generated by our brain. There's all sorts of physiological systems and hormonal systems and endocrinological things that are going on, gut-brain axis, like inflammation that impact how we feel and we experience the world. But that kind of physical health component is really important to bring into this narrative too. And we want to make sure that people have access to kind of those resources. So when we think about policy or types of change levers that we have within us, we're thinking about it very holistically. Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. And like, I feel like for people listening, they need to rewind and just listen to that again because there's so much knowledge packed in everything that you just shared. And I'm seeing it on like these different levels of like within a family unit, within a workplace, and then within like a country. But it's sounding to me like these like the 10 steps that you shared that you found are pivotal to cultivating I guess a mental health strategy for the people and for the systems to support a system or a group of people that thrive. It's applicable on all levels.
Yeah, I love that you said that. We don't tell that particular narrative all the time, but I really like it. It's true. Some of them may need to be perceived slightly differently, like what we mean by communications, because this framework, the 10 mental health index, the 10 domains, they're not steps necessarily because they can be done out of order, but they're the 10 kind of things you should do to create a healthy workforce. You're right. They have elements, they can be tied down to things that individuals can do, organizations can do, and then larger systems it can do, whether those larger systems are, a city or a country or, the EU.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that a lot, Grace.
I'm curious, you told, or at least I think you said you did some work in developing programs in East Africa and Japan. And just in this conversational element of how systems differ across cultures, across countries, even how people relate to work and things like that. I guess I'm just curious if you could share a little bit about that experience and what you've noticed differed within the different cultures and things like that and how it affected people.
Sure. Maybe I could start with what those programs were. So in East Africa, as Kenya, we worked in two areas, counties outside of Nairobi, which are more rural communities. And what we were trying to do, really in collaboration, we were supporting our colleagues that were based in Nairobi and Kenya and real leaders in mental health in that space there to help build clinical care infrastructure in places where there wasn't any. And by that, I mean that, just like in big cities, people in smaller towns experience mental distress, have mental health conditions or mental health illness, or experience difficult things. And oftentimes in more rural communities, there aren't clinicians, doctors of any kind sometimes to be able to detect that something's going on, diagnose if that's appropriate, and then most importantly, connect them to some sort of care that's going to help address it. What we were working on was helping train people who aren't clinicians per se, but who have community knowledge and have expertise of other kinds, whether it's lived experience or, like I said, community knowledge, as community health workers who can screen and detect kind of priority mental health conditions. And we were using a framework from the World Health Organization called the MH-GAP framework. It's Mental Health Gap Action Program Intervention Guide. It's essentially saying, when you don't have, fancy hospitals and clinics and community centers and trained psychiatrists and trained psychologists, what can you still do to get people care in these low resource environments? And part of it is like, let's focus on the 8 to 10 most likely conditions to see, things like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, PTSD. And let's train people to understand what the common signs and symptoms are. And then the next step is to say, well, if they have these, here are the types of medications that you can prescribe to them. Here are the types of therapy, communal therapy, individual therapy. Oftentimes there was very little there to engage with in terms of the therapeutic element. That's kind of what we were working on building out too. But that was a part in East Africa. That project, in terms of the cultural elements, there are so many. First of all, we were North American-based scientists collaborating with our African colleagues to do the work. We don't know the systems like they do. We don't know the people like they do. The policies to get into a community, to build trust and engage the community, so they use services and help you sculpt the services in this kind of very thoughtful, collaborative way. That leadership was all with our colleagues in Africa. So when you do this work, you have to appreciate that there's requirement and necessity for leadership from the local communities. The way culture impacts the work that we do more concretely, let's start from individual levels. Where people seek help can be culturally dependent. For example, in some of the communities that we worked in Kenya, when someone experienced a psychotic episode, they didn't necessarily go to a doctor. They didn't think that was a medical thing always. Some people thought it was a curse from their ancestors, or they were being possessed. And if you're being possessed, who are you going to go to? You're going to go to a traditional healer or a faith healer. So part of the work that we did was not just train community health workers, but we also trained faith and traditional healers, because that's where people were showing up for care. And so that's one way which culture impacts, like where people even go, how they even conceptualize their own condition, right? And that is also a story that we tell ourselves. Like, I am not sick. I'm being punished. I don't have depression. I have,
or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a story. And so when you're developing programs in these countries, just as like you would do if you were developing in New York City, you have to understand how people talk about what they're going through, the language that they use. Because if you come in with a diagnosis that says X, Y, and Z, and they are explaining it, the same entity, but in, A, B, C, it's going to look like they don't have it, but they do, but it's just being articulated using the language that they have accessibility to, and which may differ. So where we plan services, how we plan services, how we train people to detect, we're all sculpted by culture. People's openness to therapy, that's sculpted by culture, right? Some people, some cultures, like they're against kind of modern medical interventions. Like they probably wouldn't want to take a medication. So then what? Some people, when you have a therapy session, that's so novel. Like some cultures are, in Japan, for example, there's more stoicism in the culture and holding things in and less wanting to put the burden on others. So kind of group therapy may not necessarily work as well in that context. In Japan, to go to that piece, there, what we were doing was working on a project that used the arts to help people who were um, impacted by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant and the tsunami in 2013. Many of them were, voluntarily or involuntarily displaced, lost family members, lost their community, had to rebuild in a new community, impacted marriages, it impacted family structures, impacted individual people. And we were using the arts because Japan has, such a rich history of like kabuki theater and other types of theater, no theater to engage people in kind of this novel way that's not only therapy based, which is, very cognitively based, right? And kind of about signs and emotions, but can we use art to mirror certain experiences and use it as a way to open up conversations that are really important? Um, and there again, the way we sculpted the program, we didn't use, Shakespeare, we used traditional stories. Who was performing it? Who got to be in the room when people were being vulnerable? Whether it was a group session versus kind of individual sessions, the types of questions we asked, how, the ways we framed ideas, the types of follow-up that were even available to people after the fact were all sculpted by where we were doing the work. It's very much sculpted by that. The one thing I would say though is that, often I've come from a global mental health background. I've done a lot of global mental health work, and people often want to talk about the culture piece in a way that is extremely important because culture does impact so much. But there's a human experience that is unifying. And we see distress showing up in Japan the same way we see distress showing up in Kenya, and the same way we see distress showing up in Atlanta, right? Because we're people. There's a lot that unifies us, just like there's a lot that is unique to the environments in which we work. And I think the exciting element of global health work and just work of many kinds is finding that balance and ability to toggle and appreciate and kind of move between precision and uniqueness of the person and the context and seeing the unifying principles that are valuable and relevant across cultures.
I love that so much because I think that's it's funny how that relates to storytelling as well. And what I found in a good story that can resonate across the globe is the fact that we all experience the same human emotions. And
Right.
it might be in a different language or it might look different, but when we see something that touches on an emotion that we've all felt, whether it's heartbreak or love, no matter what language you speak, you can resonate with that. So I really appreciate that perspective that you shared.
Thank you.
Tahilia, I just love how your mind works and you're so articulate in explaining these sometimes very complex topics that can seem overwhelming to a lot of us in this journey of, us discovering more about ourselves and wanting to maybe change certain scripts that we're living by or the stories that we are telling themselves. But ultimately, I feel really encouraged from our conversation today. I feel just a light from you and really even just you doing the work that you are, that I really feel this message, or this conversation is a message of hope and encouragement for people, that really, if they are stuck in a hard place, if they do feel maybe victim to the stories that are passed down or the stories that are framing their lives now, that there are always possible ways to change and to grow from these things. So I just really appreciate having you on today.
Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, Grace. Really appreciate being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tahilia. And I hope our viewers will walk away from this with tools and strategies to better support the change that you want to make in your life, just in thoughts around mental health and the way that our thoughts can impact our actions and our behaviors and ultimately our lives.
If our viewers want to know more about your work, where can they find out more?
Yeah, so we have One Mind, the organization I currently work for, has a website, onemind.org. And we have a LinkedIn page, and I have a personal LinkedIn page. I have also Google Scholar, if there's some scientists out there that want to follow some of my publications. Those are the three primary ways. We're pretty active as an organization on social media, and there's a lot of updates on kind of the various projects and initiatives we're leading, many of which are open access. And if you want to get involved, there are likely some opportunities in the coming months.
And just before you leave, I wanted to ask, is there anything that you're looking forward to, both personally or professionally?
Oh, gosh. Yes. I mean, I'm not going to answer this in terms of 5 years. I'm going to answer this in terms of 200 years from now. One of the things that I always think about is, what is this world going to look like in 200 years? And I feel really hopeful for it. I think there's a lot of signs that look kind of shady and bad, but I think the world, and I believe in people, and I believe in non-linearity. I think hope is the belief in non-linearity, that just because we've been doing certain things this way, it doesn't mean we're always going to do it. I think and hope that we come together as humanity to make a real change towards all of the big kind of societal issues, including changing the culture of that we experience and impact our mental health and well-being. I'm curious to see where that goes, and at least in my lifetime, how that changes. How young people are going to access care and what they're going to, what healthy is going to look like in that time. And personally, I am looking forward to learning and continuing to grow and be sculpted by all the people that I have met and yet to meet.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. To learn more about today's guests and find related links and resources, visit the episode page at nexusexperience.com. You'll also find our full podcast archive. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review letting us know. Sharing the show with your friends is also incredibly helpful. You can find us at Inside Coffee Break on socials. For updates, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter on Substack. Today's show was edited by our co-host Grace Chung. We appreciate your love and support. See you in the next episode.